Elias Rourke had not spoken a full sentence to another soul in over a decade. He lived where the land rolled dry and golden beneath a relentless sky, a place too forgotten to have a name. The kind of place where maps curled at the edges and trails disappeared into dust. His nearest neighbor was 42 miles west, and even that man had only been glimpsed once in passing, leading a mule train into the canyon. The townfolk, those that still remembered Elias, figured he was long dead or close to it. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he'd always been. But the truth, as it often is, was far more complicated and far more quiet. Elias's cabin sat crooked on a slope that overlooked a dried-up stream and a corral that had not seen a horse in 9 years. The roof sagged like an old man's, back-patched with whatever wood or tin he could scavenge from storms. Inside, everything had a place: the boots by the door, the rifle above the mantel, the flint and steel in the same drawer for 15 years. Dust blanketed everything like time itself had grown tired of moving forward. The man himself was no less weathered. Elias had a face carved from the same stone as the range-deep lines, sun-blackened skin, a beard gone more gray than brown. His hands were thick with calluses, veins like cords beneath thin, papery skin. He rarely looked at himself anymore, except when he trimmed his beard with the rusted shears he kept beside his Bible. That book sat on the shelf, worn to softness, though he hadn't opened it in years. It was the only thing his wife had touched. Before she died, he kept it out of reverence, not faith. Each morning he rose with the sun and went to bed with it. In between, he worked the land as best he could, planting things that refused to grow and mending fences no animal had tested in years. He spoke only to himself, or sometimes to the wind, which answered in creaks and howls. His dog, Buckshot, had died 6 winters ago. He'd buried him beneath the juniper tree, and ever since, Elias avoided that part of the yard. There had been a time when he was not alone, but that time was long gone. His wife, Miriam, had been the only person to see through the silence. In him she hadn't needed words, she'd spoken in touch, in long glances, in quiet meals shared at dusk. Their life was small, but full in its own way, until the day fever took her. There'd been no doctor to call, no neighbors to help, just Elias, boiling cloth in the fire, watching her slip away. She died in the same bed they shared for 21 years. And after burying her beneath a circle of stones, Elias built the fence higher and nailed shut the gate. The world didn't come for him, and he didn't go looking for it. Sometimes, in winter, he would hear a rider pass on the horizon, a faint echo of hooves across the shale, and he'd watch from behind the window, hand on his rifle. Other times, during storm season, he'd find letters nailed to his fence, from town officials asking him to sell the land. He never answered. The letters stopped after the 5th year. By then, Elias had become part of the landscape, no more alive, in their minds, than the crows that circled his chimney. But the loneliness didn't feel like punishment. It felt like balance. He kept journals, not the kind with confessions or poetry, but notes, weather patterns, cattle counts from memory, dreams. Once he wrote down a full dream where Miriam had spoken his name. He read that page every year on the day she died. That was his only ritual. He didn't drink anymore, hadn't since the first year without her, when he'd burned the whiskey out of his body and buried the last bottle beneath the barn. The silence was his penance, the prairie, his chapel. He never expected anything to change. That was the truth of it. Elias Rourke was not waiting to be found. He wasn't looking for redemption, nor did he believe the world owed him anything. He'd made peace with the dust, the wind, the slow ache in his spine. He had grown into the land, become part of its rhythm. Even death did not scare him. He had dug a shallow grave behind the barn, where a stone marked with his initials sat quietly, waiting. The day would come, and when it did, he would walk into it like he'd walked into every storm, unflinching, alone, silent. So when the knock came, soft and barely audible, it did not register as real. He had been out chopping wood. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the range, and the axe had grown heavy in his hand. He was about to set it down when he thought he heard it. Tap, tap, like a branch brushing the porch. He paused, listened. Nothing. Probably just the wind. But then it came again. A second time. Then a third. Elias turned slowly, the years pressing down on his joints, and made his way to the cabin. His rifle leaned beside the door, and he took it without thought. Habit. Always habit. He stepped to the porch and opened the door. What he saw stopped him cold. There, just beyond the steps, stood 5 women. Their dresses were white, or had once been, now soiled with dust and ash. They stood barefoot, their skin raw from sun and wind. One of them, the tallest, looked up at him with eyes hollowed by something deeper than fear. Her hands shook. Behind her, another carried something in her arms wrapped in a linen cloth. Elias thought it might be a baby at first, but the shape was wrong. None of them spoke. They didn't move. Elias didn't know whether to raise the rifle or drop it. He cleared his throat, the sound foreign in his own ears, and said, "You lost." The tallest woman opened her mouth, but no sound came. She looked over her shoulder, then back at Elias. Finally, she stepped forward. kneeled at the edge of the porch, and laid the bundle on the boards. It was a shoe, a child's shoe. Stained red dot. Then she whispered 2 words, "Help us." And for the first time in 17 years, Elias Rourke felt something move inside his chest, something sharp and alive, like a broken prayer, rising from ash. Elias Rourke had not opened that door in years, not truly. Yes, he had crossed the threshold countless times, moving in and out of his world, like a ghost, returning to the shell of a house, long abandoned. But the real door, the one made not of pine and hinges but of memory and flesh, that door had stayed shut since the day Miriam passed. Since the day he buried her under the earth without ceremony, eulogy, or prayer. The weight of that door wasn't measured in timber, but in years. And now, 5 women stood on the other side of it, not knocking anymore, but waiting, wordless, barefoot, and broken. Elias didn't remember moving. His body acted on something ancient, deeper than instinct. He stooped, knees cracking, and picked up the child's bloodstained shoe left on his porch. His fingers trembled around it, not because of the gore, but because of the smallness. He hadn't held anything so delicate in years. It was no bigger than his palm, the leather cracked but soft, the sole nearly worn through. It felt like a question he didn't know how to answer. The tallest woman was still kneeling, her eyes, hollow but focused, bore into him. There was strength beneath her exhaustion, not just survival, but defiance. Whatever had driven her to his door, it hadn't been weakness. That, more than the shoe, gave Elias pause. He looked at the rifle still in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he set it against the doorframe. That simple act, surrendering the weapon, even symbolically, marked a crack in the wall he'd built. Around himself, he didn't know why he did it. Didn't know why he didn't turn them away, why he hadn't already. But some part of him, long buried, had stirred. Something that looked like memory, or mercy. "Come in," he said, voice gravelly from disuse. The women hesitated. They looked at each other, unsure, like animals testing unfamiliar ground. Then the kneeling woman stood and stepped forward. One by one, the others followed. No words, no thanks. Just the shuffle of tired feet on old floorboards, the whisper of linen skirts brushing doorframe, and a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. The last to enter was the smallest, barely a woman, maybe 17. She lingered on the porch, hand trembling as she reached for the doorframe. She turned once and glanced behind her, toward the hills beyond the fence. Elias followed her gaze and saw nothing, only the haze of heat rising from the land. The dying light stretching the shadows thin, but her eyes told him there was something out there, something she feared. And that fear followed her inside. Elias shut the door. For a long moment, no one moved. He stood with his back to the wood, staring at them. They stood like statues in his living room, mismatched against the crude simplicity of his life. But the hearth was cold, the floor scattered with sawdust and clay dust. His only chair sat by the fire, patched with rope and hide. A tin cup lay on the table beside a jar of preserved beans. No home had been made ready for them. And yet, here they were. "What happened?" Elias finally asked. The tallest one looked at him, eyes too tired for tears. She had sharp cheekbones and hair that might have once been golden but now hung limp and ashen. Her voice, when it came, was almost a breath. "They're hunting us." 3 words. Enough to change everything. Elias felt the old habits rise in him, not fear, not yet, but caution. His mind, dulled by years of repetition and solitude, suddenly sharpened. He had seen nothing in the sky, no smoke, heard no hooves, no distant gunfire, no bird call silenced. But her voice didn't lie. Whatever she meant by hunting, it wasn't metaphor. "Who?" he asked, but she didn't answer. None of them did. Instead, the youngest one, the girl who had lingered last, began to cry. Softly at first, as though ashamed of the sound. Elias turned toward her and saw the way her shoulders shook. She bit her knuckle to muffle it. He hadn't heard another person cry in over a decade, and the sound unnerved him more than anything else could have. He moved to the hearth and began lighting a fire. It gave him something to do with his hands. The women said nothing as he worked, striking flint and steel with practiced precision. When the flame caught, it cast a flickering glow across their faces. They looked even more fragile in the light, like ghosts he'd summoned with a wish he didn't know he'd made. As the fire grew, so did the questions in his mind. Who were they? Where had they come from? What were they running from? And why? Of all the places in the world, had they come here? He didn't ask again. Not yet. Instead, he brought them water. Not much, but enough to wet their lips and clean their faces. He had 4 tin cups. He gave the 5th woman his own. They drank, slowly, carefully, as if afraid to use too much. One of them, a dark-haired woman with a thin scar down her temple, sipped and then poured a little into her palm, rubbing it gently on the youngest girl's forehead. Elias watched. In another life, he might have offered blankets, food, words of comfort, but those instincts had been buried with Miriam. What remained were the actions. Build the fire, pour the water, protect the perimeter. So he did those things, without ceremony, without speech. Later, when the women had settled on the floor, too proud to take his bed, or too uncertain, Elias sat in his chair and watched the door. He kept the rifle within reach. That night, the wind howled against the windows, and from far off, on the edge of the hills, Elias heard something he hadn't heard in years. A whistle. It was faint, one long note, too short like a bird call, but not. It was a signal. He knew it. He had used it himself long ago, during the raids, when messages had to travel without words. Elias didn't move, neither did the women. They had heard it too. And suddenly, the quiet of his life no longer felt like peace. It felt like the pause before a storm. Something was coming. And Elias Rourke, who had once vowed never to open his door again, found himself preparing to defend what had entered. The next morning broke with a strange stillness. Elias Rourke stood at the edge of his porch, the wind brushing the rim of his hat as dawn cracked the distant hills with orange light. The sky was wide and unmarred, too wide, too clear, as if it were waiting to be stained by something unseen. Behind him, in the house he had once built with his wife, 5 strangers still slept on the hard floor, curled in silence like relics from a forgotten war. But something about the night had changed him. Elias could feel it, like a knot pulled too tight in the gut, like the air just before a rifle's report. He hadn't spoken to them much after the whistle. The women had said nothing, just looked at each other, shared a glance, and then, without a word, gathered themselves tighter, as if preparing for something inevitable. It was the way animals brace for a cold snap. Elias had seen it before, when a horse senses a mountain lion long before any man does, or when a dog turns silent before thunder. It was the instinct of the hunted. He fed the fire, boiled water for cornbread, and fixed a small pot of beans. The food was meager, but it was something. He left it near them, then stepped out onto the land he'd worked for 30 years, his range, his dust, his fence line stretching into the distance like scars carved into the earth. He didn't like the quiet, not now. By mid-morning, 2 of the women had woken. The eldest, the tall one with the golden turn-dashed hair, stepped outside. Her bare feet crunched the gravel. She looked older in the daylight, not by age, but by experience. Her face was sun-touched and firm, her eyes squinting like she was already reading what lay on the horizon. Elias poured her a mug of weak coffee. She took it wordlessly, then sat on the step, cradling it in her hands like it might disappear. "You didn't tell me your name," Elias said. She glanced sideways. "A name won't matter if we don't see another sunrise. You think it's that close?" "I know it is." Elias shifted, uncomfortable. "You said someone was hunting you. You gonna tell me who?" She looked at him for a long time, and then, in a voice so even it chilled him more than shouting ever could, she said, "Have you ever heard of the White Suns?" Elias froze. The White Suns, a name like dry ash in the mouth. Not a government unit, not any official militia, but worse. They were men once, or so people claimed. Ranchers turned zealots, cowboys turned exorcists. They believed in bloodline purity, in sacred dominion, in the old myths twisted cruelly. To them, women who defied command, women who spoke out, or healed without license, or wandered too far from male supervision, were witches, possessed, polluted. Elias had heard whispers years ago. Border towns burned, native widows found hanging from cottonwood trees. A convent razed to its stones, all 36 nuns vanished. But they had always been far away. Rumors, specters on horseback. "You crossed them?" Elias asked. "We survived them," she said. "That's enough." He didn't push further, just nodded slowly. She didn't owe him her story, not yet, and truth be told, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it, because once you heard it, you were in. Once you knew the names, the dates, the blood spilled, you couldn't pretend you weren't part of it. Inside, the others were waking. The girl with the scar, whose name, he later learned, was May, was braiding the youngest's hair. A gentle thing, done with deliberate care, as if pretending the world outside didn't exist. One woman limped to the water basin and began washing her face. Another sat quietly by the fire, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. They had rhythms, habits, a bond formed by terror and persistence. Elias recognized it. Years ago, during the Comanche Wars, he'd seen men in his company who survived massacres. They moved the same way, half present, half haunted, always glancing behind them, sleeping with one eye open. They weren't paranoid, they were accurate. After breakfast, he saddled his horse and rode out to check the fence line, not because it needed checking, but because he needed to see. From the ridge, he could scan the lowlands and trail for dust clouds, smoke, hoofprints, anything. He found something within 20 minutes. At the bend, near Miller's Draw, a boot print. Too clean, too deliberate, and not one of his. Elias dismounted, knelt, examined. It was recent, still damp from dew, and it pointed north. Then another, and another. They were being followed. He returned by noon, face hard, lips tight. The women didn't ask what he'd seen, they already knew. That evening, Elias finally asked the question burning in his mind. "Why here?" The tall woman, whose name was revealed to be Aline, answered slowly. "Because of the map." He frowned. "What map?" She reached into a small canvas satchel none of them had dared touch until now and drew out a crumpled sheet of hide. It was old hand-drawn ink, faded but legible. It wasn't a topographical map or a cattle route. It was a symbolic map, cryptic sigils, crude landmarks, sun and moon patterns that meant nothing to outsiders. At the center of the map, a cabin, drawn in sharp charcoal strokes. "That's your house," she said. Elias's blood ran cold. Ellis's blood ran cold. Hook pointed to a symbol at the bottom, a shape he recognized, though he hadn't seen it in 20 years. It was Miriam's sigil, a sunburst over water, the same she used when writing prayers in her journal, the same she carved once into the beam above their bed. "My wife," he began, voice hoarse. She died years ago. "She lived first," Eline said quietly, "and she left something behind." Elias sat back, stunned. The silence stretched like a taut wire. "What did she leave?" he finally asked. Ellen touched the center of the map. "A sanctuary, a place warded by something older than law." And just like that, the truth began to bloom like wildfire behind Elias's ribs. His home, this land, wasn't just a retreat. Miriam had made it something more, something sacred. And these women hadn't stumbled here by mistake. They had followed a thread, a whisper, a hope. But hope had a price. And out there, not far off, were men who knew how to snuff it out. Elias stood and took a long breath. "I'll bury fresh traps tonight," he said. "You'll need to help me reinforce the west line." None of the women asked why. They just nodded. Because they, too, knew. By morning, the world would change. And Elias Rourke, the man who swore never to open his heart again, would have to decide whether to become the shield, the sword, or the grave. The sun had long since sunk beneath the rim of the earth, casting its last golden rays over the quiet hills as the sixth evening arrived. For the first time in years, the house wasn't still. The man who had once only known the sound of his boots on wooden floors, the creak of a rocking chair, or the rustle of wind through his empty porch, now moved through his cabin, with voices murmuring behind him, 5 shadows, soft as moths, fluttering just beyond reach. The women had stayed, not by force nor by obligation, but because something in the air around him felt safer than any town ever had. He didn't ask them to remain. He didn't have to dot each day since their arrival. They had begun to live a life, stitched from pieces, fragments of trust, broken silences, small kindnesses. The one with the scarred wrist, Lena, had begun boiling tea in the mornings. She never asked if anyone wanted it. She simply made it and left it there. The youngest, Miriam, still barely spoke, but she had taken to feeding the chickens and collecting eggs with an instinct so calm that even the animals didn't flinch at her steps. The rancher, once a figure of solitude and shadow, had stopped keeping track of the days. Time no longer stretched before him like an endless noose. The rhythm of things changed. Mornings began with shared silence and the smell of firewood smoke. By midday, someone was always humming. At night, the 5 women curled up in the old cabin like wildcats, finally given space to rest. He never asked what they had fled from. He knew terror when he saw it. And whatever had driven them to his door in the white dresses, dusty, torn, and stained, was not something that needed to be coaxed out with questions. But time, as it always does, begins to unwrap what the heart has buried. It was Lena who first spoke of it, just after midnight on the 7th night. The sky was split by a thunderless lightning storm, jagged blue cracks illuminating the clouds. She stood at the doorway, the frame casting her like a statue carved in defiance. The rancher had risen from his chair and moved beside her quietly. "They branded us," she said softly. Her voice didn't tremble, not on the skin, not just. "They marked everything we believed in, made us forget our names, replaced them with numbers." He didn't reply, but something in his jaw tightened. "They called it a sanctuary," she continued, her voice low. "But it was a prison for women who asked too many questions, spoke out, said no, or just existed the wrong way. We were told we were broken, and they offered to fix us." He had never heard anything more familiar. The man had lived long enough to know the world wasn't fair. But there was something more, insidious in how calmly she spoke, as if injustice had made itself so at home in their lives, it had become ordinary. He looked at her hands, strong, scarred, not from fieldwork but from resistance. She had fought. They all had. Not with fists, maybe, but with survival. "I buried men like that," the rancher finally said, "in shallow graves on borrowed land. Thought I was done with violence." She didn't look at him. "We're not asking for vengeance," she whispered. "We're asking for freedom." And then came the morning when freedom knocked, not gently. A black horse galloped up the ridge. Its rider wore gray, a minister's robe, but not one soaked in faith. He had come not with prayer, but proclamation. In his hand, a scroll. In his eyes, the kind of cold that had once made children hide under their beds. The women saw him first, and froze. The rancher stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. His hand did not reach for his rifle, but it rested near it, not threatening, but not hiding either. The rider unrolled the scroll. "By order of the Church of Obedient Grace," he declared, "you are harboring stolen property. 5 women belonging to the sanctified commune of high calling. Miriam, the youngest, began to shake. Women ain't property, the rancher said, least not on this land. They are consecrated. The man replied, they fled the Lord's custody. They are to be returned for correction. They crossed the desert for 3 days on foot. The rancher said evenly, ain't correction that drove them. Was survival. The minister's eyes narrowed. You will be punished for obstruction. You go ahead and try. And just like that, the old man who had spoken to barely a soul in 5 years found himself standing between them and an institution powerful enough to make law out of cruelty. The days that followed turned the ranch into something sacred and dangerous. Word traveled faster than wind across the prairie. The church would return, not with words, next time, but men. Armed, convicted, righteous in the way tyrants always are. But something else traveled. Faster. Whispers spread among women in nearby towns. Some remembered the white dresses. Others had daughters who never returned from pilgrimage. The story, fueled by silence and broken hearts, began to burn in the bellies of mothers, sisters, wives, until something ancient woke in them. By the 9th sunrise, they began arriving. 1 by 1, 2 by 2, women of all kinds. Some with babies on their hips, some carrying nothing but a walking stick. They came not with pitchforks, but presents. They lined the road leading to the ranch. They brought food, water, blankets. No words were spoken. Their eyes said everything. We are not property. When the church's men arrived, 12 riders cloaked in smoke gray, they found not a ranch, but a wall of women stretching across the dirt path. 50 wide, silent as stone. The rancher stood at the gate, not armed. Just present. This is trespass, the lead rider said. No, sir, the rancher replied. This is witness. A standoff in the dust. The horses stamped. The air shook up. The women didn't flinch. Then came Lena, stepping forward, white dress still. Dirt-stained but shining under the morning sun, like some kind of armor. We are not yours, she said. The riders did not move. Not because of fear, but because they had never been told no by so many before. One rider turned, then another. Then all. By the time the sun reached its peak, the cloud of dust had settled. The threat had passed, but something larger had arrived. The ranch became a haven, not just for the 5, but for any who walked away from chains. A movement without a leader. A place without law, except the law of mercy. The rancher did not change his ways. He still walked slowly, still carved wood in silence, still lit a fire before the sky turned. But now, he was not alone. He was not waiting to die. He was making room. One day, months later, a child wandered into the barn, pointed to an old carved horse the rancher had whittled, and asked, "Did your wife make this?" The rancher, for the first time in decades, smiled. "No," he said, "but she would have liked the one who did." The 5 women never spoke again of the place they came from. Not because they were afraid, but because they had built something stronger in its place. And as for the man who had once lived alone, he never closed his door again.